So now that we're getting our filters here, we have to manage them in the tab screen, and we then have to make sure that we pass the updated list of available meals based on the filters that were set to the categories screen. Because in that categories screen, we then need to pass the filtered meals down to the meals screen. And in the future, we'll have to filter not just based on the selected category, but also on the filters that have been set. So for that, back here in tab start, I'll get rid of this line where we printed our selected filters, and I will instead add a new variable to this tabs screen state where I want to store the selected filters. This new variable will be of type map, and it will be a map where the keys are of this filter type and the values are booleans. And we can name this variable selected filters like this. And initially, this should be a map where I also set all these filters, so gluten-free and so on. But initially, I'll set this to false, and it will then be updated once some filters have been set. So we have gluten-free, lactose-free, which initially is false, so the filter is not enabled. That is what false means. Vegetarian is set to false, and also vegan is set to false. That's the initial value here. And this value should now be updated whenever we receive new information from the filters screen. So therefore here in set screen where we get this result, and this result is just such a map of filters as you learned, we want to set the selected filters equal to the selected result. Now, storing the filters like this is not enough, because we also should make sure that the build method is executed again, so that the updated filters or an updated list of available meals is passed to the categories screen. By the way, not to the meals screen, because I don't want to filter the meals that are visible on that screen. Of course, you could filter there as well, but my logic is that favorites should always be visible no matter which filters were selected. That's why I only worry about the categories screen. Therefore, here in set screen, I'll call set state and set my filters like this. And here we now also have the problem that result could be null, and null is not an allowed value here for selected filters. And therefore here I'll use a special operator, the double question mark operator, which is an operator built into Dart, which simply checks whether the value in front of it is null, and if it is null, the fallback value defined after the double question marks will be used. So this operator allows you to set up a conditional fallback value in case this value should be null. And the fallback value I want to use here, if result should be null, is essentially this map of initial filters again. And therefore, to avoid some code duplication, we can actually also add a new variable, a new global variable, or even a constant, which we're never going to change internally, that could be named k initial filters, k at the beginning, to kind of follow this Flutter convention of naming global variables with a k at the beginning. Technically, it's not required. But this would be my initial filters, and that's now what I use here for initializing selected filters. But what we can also use as a fallback value down there after the double question mark. And with that, we're setting the selected filters whenever we come back from the filters screen. And now we can use these selected filters to update the meals we're showing once we picked a category on the categories screen. So now when it comes to passing the filter data to the categories screen, we have two main options. We can either pass a list of available meals, which then can be picked up and used from inside this categories screen, or we pass the filters and add the logic for filtering out certain meals to this categories screen. And I'll go for the former option, where I actually create an already filtered list of available meals, which can then filter a bit more for a fitting category inside of the categories screen. So therefore here I'll add a new final variable, available meals, which in the end are my dummy meals, which are coming from the dummy data Dart file, which therefore also must be imported into this tabs Dart file. And now the available meals here should be the dummy meals, filtered such that the selected filters here are taken into account. Now for that we can use the where method, as you learned, which exists on all list objects and which allows us to filter a list. We pass this function to where, which you saw before, which is executed on every list item, so on every meal, and we receive that value inside of this function. And then in here we want to return true if the meal should be kept and false otherwise if it should be dropped. But of course this should now be derived dynamically, and to derive it dynamically I'll add a if check in there in this anonymous function that's passed to where I take a look at my selected filters and I take a look at the gluten-free filter, for example, by accessing that value by its key, and that will be true or false, true if the filter is set, false otherwise. So with this code here, I'm essentially checking whether the gluten-free filter is set, and I combine this with another condition, with this double ampersand operator, which I introduced before in the course, to check that if this filter is set, I want to take a look if this meal maybe is not gluten-free. Now the meal has a is gluten-free flag, a property called is gluten-free, which is true or false. And I want to check if that is not true by adding an exclamation mark in front of this. That's how you can check for the opposite of a certain value in Dart. So is gluten-free is true or false, and I want to check whether it is not true. And I do this by adding an exclamation mark here. So if I only want to show meals that are gluten-free, and this meal here is not gluten-free, then I don't want to include it, so then I'll return false. That's what I'm doing here. And here I also need to add an exclamation mark after this code, which does now not check for the opposite. This only happens if you add it in front of a value. If you add it after a value, it's simply a Dart feature which you saw before, which tells Dart that this value in front of the exclamation mark will never be null. And I know that this will never be null because selected filters will always be set to at least this starting map, which has all these keys. So with that, I'm checking whether this filter is set and whether our meal maybe does not satisfy this filter, in which case I return false and exclude this meal. And now this logic can be repeated for all filters. So I can also check for the lactose-free filter, if this is set and active. And if it is, I want to exclude meals that are not lactose-free. And then I repeat this again for vegetarian. And I want to exclude meals that are not vegetarian. And last but not least, of course, also for vegan. Exclude meals that are not vegan. That is the logic here. And with that, available meals will be a list that only includes meals that meet our filter conditions. Or to be precise, it will be an iterable, and therefore here I will call toList to make sure that I actually return a list and not an iterable. And I also need to add one more return statement here in this anonymous function that's passed to where I return true. Otherwise, I just have a bunch of checks that potentially return false, but I never return true for the meals that I actually want to keep. And of course, I definitely do want to keep all meals that don't make it into these if blocks, so that meet all the filters set, and that's why return true is needed here at the end. And with that, we're getting this available meals list, and it's now this list that should be passed to the categories screen. So there we can add a new property, a list which is full of meals, and it could be named available meals. Sounds like a fitting name. We of course also add it here as a required parameter, like this. And now it's the available meals instead of all the dummy meals that we'll use as a starting point for finding meals that fit the category that was selected. So here we now use available meals instead of dummy meals. With that added, with this parameter added to the categories screen, we can go back to the tabs screen, and there, when we create the categories screen, we can set the available meals to the available meals we are deriving here. So to the value stored in this variable, like this. And now with that, last but not least, we should be able to filter our meals as expected. If I now go to filters and I, for example, only show vegetarian meals, so I exclude all meals that are not vegetarian, I don't see anything if I go to hamburgers. And under quick and easy, I also have less meals available. So this now indeed does work the way it should work. And if I set more filters, like gluten-free and vegan, and also lactose-free, I of course see even less meals, because now I narrowed this down even more. And that of course therefore works as it should. The only thing that's not working is that if I go back to the filters screen, all filters are reset back to nothing. So therefore thereafter I also see all meals again. And that's of course not how it should work. Instead, the filters I set here should be saved so that they are also shown again if I go back to the filters screen. Now to save those filters and to not reset them if I go back to the filters screen, we have to make sure that from the tabs screen, we pass the currently active filters to the filters screen so that there, instead of initializing all the filters as false, as we're currently doing it, we're actually initializing those filters to the values that have been set before. And to do that, we can go to the filters screen here and add a new property and parameter to our filters screen widget. The property can be named current filters, and the type of value stored in this property should be this map of filters, like this. And of course, then I expect to get this as a parameter. Now that we do get this, we can use the current filters to initialize our filter state variables here. Now, since we're technically in a different class here, we're not in the widget class, but in the state class, we can't access current filters like this here. Instead, you learned earlier that there is this special widget property which you can use to access the properties and methods of the widget class, like current filters. The only problem with that is that the widget property is not available here where you're initializing your class variables. Instead, it's only available inside of the methods of this class. Therefore, what I'll do as a workaround is I'll initialize all those values as false again, but I will add this init state method, which you also saw earlier in the course already. And here, after calling super init state, I'll overwrite those initial values here, like gluten-free filter set, with the values I got here in my widget, so with the current filters. Because here in init state, we can use this special widget property to get access to the current filters. And then here we can access filter gluten-free, for example, to get the initial value for this variable. We just have to add an exclamation mark here to tell Dart that this will not be null, which we know it won't because this is a required parameter. So with that, we're initializing it like this. And here we also don't need to call setState because init state will run before the build method executes anyways. So these here are the values that will be available once the build method executes without us calling setState here. And I'll then repeat this for all these state variables. Here I'm accessing current filters, filter lactose free with an exclamation mark. Then we repeat this for vegetarian filter set and access filter vegetarian. And last but not least, here we have vegan filter set and access filter.vegan. So with that, we now initialize these state variables to the actual values that have been saved as state before. At least if we make sure that the current filters are passed to the filters screen when it's being activated. And therefore we have to go to the place where we are activating this screen, so where we are pushing this screen, which is the tab start file. And there in the place where we are pushing this screen, here we now have to set this newly added current filters parameter. and set it to our selected filters map. And now we have to remove const here because now a dynamic value is passed to filters screen. So with that, we now should preserve those filters that have been selected. And hence, if we reload this and I set some filters here, those of course still affect those meal lists as before. But if I go back to filters, you now see that this was saved, and therefore of course it also still applies if I go back to my meals. If I then go back and clear those filters or choose different filters, that of course will also be taken into account, and now I see more meals again. And that's now the finished Meals app.